Welcome to Finding Faith, the space we come to share stories of encounter, ask questions, and share in the lived experience of others. As you listen to the stories of our interview guests, I ask that you consider the courage it takes to stand before your peers and share your experience of faith for the benefit of another. My name is Jessie Bennett, and this is the 21st episode of Finding Faith. Today we have with us Amanda Payne. Amanda, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Amanda Payne. I am 34 years old. I'm married to Caleb Payne. We have 5 children. Felicity is my oldest. She is 12. Ben is 11. Ava is 8. Veronica is 4. And Elizabeth is 15 months. I went to St. Mary's for most of my elementary education. I went to Whitesville Elementary in and out a couple of times, and then graduated from Trinity High School. My husband and I both went there. We dated since 2001 or 2002, I'm sorry. Went to college, went to UK, and then got married in 2007. Our first baby in 2008.
Nice. Amanda's going to share with us today her story of how experiences with tragedy and loss help to shape her understanding of who God is and what her faith means to her. Amanda, why don't you go ahead and tell us your story?
I think to really analyze my finding faith story, I have to break my life out into themes so far. My parents are an integral part of who I am now. My mom was always creating a Jesus-centered atmosphere. She was getting us to pray and say the rosary, even against our will. She was like, it was definitely, she was the driving force behind that. She has just enormous amounts of faith. I'm sure that she has questions just like everyone, but she really is the pillar of faith, the kind that does not waver. My father, he was a defender of the faith, but was not particularly devout until he became critically and eventually terminally ill. Both were cradle Catholics. I know he had questions because he began an apologetic journey a few years before his passing. He was really getting into reading the heavy hitters of Catholic and Christian apologetics. Peter Kreeft, Scott Hahn, Carl Keating, C.S. Lewis. I think that he realized that his time was finite and he wanted to make up for lost time. He was only 47 when he died. So many of the themes in my life that occurred at one point or another have resonated later, and only as time has gone on have I been able to see or discern why things have happened, or to accept why I will not know and will not understand why things have happened the way that they have. As a child, I was always somewhere in the middle, academic and defensive of my faith like my dad, but also wanting and aspiring to have just the full-fledged, never have to see faith like my mom. I was also a very strong-willed, headstrong person, an arguer, and continue to be so, although time and maturity have softened that significantly, thank goodness. But I don't think it will ever truly go away. It's in my DNA. So theme number 1 would be for me to be quiet. In order for me to listen and discern anything that God wants to convey to me, I have to ask, but then I also have to be quiet and listen for the answers. So God gave me 5 kids so that I would value quiet. I think the best way to teach an impatient person patience is to make them have to be patient. So it really comes down to me saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening, and I am ready." When I was a senior in high school, a very good friend and classmate died by suicide. That was my first real experience with severe loss. I think I can speak for our whole class of 39 when I say that it was a very difficult and confusing time. Oddly enough, I keenly remember that whole experience and the details of where I was and how I felt, down to the way the weather felt. And in tragedies that I would experience later, those minute details are blocked out. I don't have the same recollection of, event after event after event. I continue to struggle with, I think as many people do who've experienced tragedies, a change in seasons. That is, sometimes it can be hard as the seasons change and you kind of go into a little dip, whether it's in your spiritual life or just, feeling a little low for a couple of weeks. And it brings with it an unsettled feeling in my heart. So my faith was shaken a bit then, but it was the first in a triad of tragedy that I would experience from 2005 to 2008. Shortly after, still in my senior year, I'd say after Christmas, my dad took a really bad turn at the end of winter. Despite his best efforts, he was going to die. He had a lung disease. It's called BOOP, which is bronchiolitis obliterans organizing pneumonia. It is not typically fatal, but he was not responding to the treatment that would have otherwise healed him, and the disease was taking a toll on his body and his organs. We discussed his funeral plans with him, and that really stands out to me now. Even then, it probably stood out quite a bit. It was very surreal to have discussed the details of his death, with him while he was alive. I do remember that very well. And I remember driving to church here at St. Mary's and going in and praying and begging God to let him please stay here with us. While we were discussing what hymns and readings he wanted at his funeral mass, he requested, "Be not afraid." That's definitely theme number 2. Dad wanted that to be played at his funeral mass, and that quote is always, every day, it's on my mind. My best friends still remind me of it when they know that I'm, feeling down. We were very privileged in that we got to say our goodbyes in the days before he passed, having experienced both grieving before the death and then an unexpected death. The time that we had before, with him prior to him passing was full of grace. I went in his room and we talked about things, what I was upset about, what he was going to miss, and how hard it was going to be to live without him. I remember saying to him that I felt like I was being robbed. I cringe thinking at how self-centered that was. I know I was 18, but here he was 47, a father and dying. And I was thinking about my loss, how this was going to affect me and, how my world was going to be shaken. But yeah, that's a cringeworthy. That time, though, that we had grieving him before his death was very holy. It was very restorative. It definitely forced me, my mother, my sister, and my brother to contemplate things like death and suffering and loss, and definitely loss of control at a young age. And I think that contemplation of death and life would come in handy later because, once you reflect on it already, you have a foundation to either you've slipped away from your faith or you've already gained that rock solid foundation, during tragedy. So my mom, she says often that my dad's passing was a holy death. He died on April 16th, 2005, and was buried on April 19th. I believe on that day, Pope Benedict XVI became our new pope. And the next day, after Mass, in the second paragraph of Pope Benedict's first message, he said, referencing Pope John Paul II, "I seem to feel his strong hand clasping mine. I seem to see his smiling eyes and hear his words. And at this moment, addressed specifically to me, do not be afraid." And that was an amazing moment for me, and it's a theme that definitely guides my life. I felt my dad's strong hand clasping mine and could hear his voice saying, "Be not afraid." He joked, actually, because when he was going downhill, we had hospice called in. So he had a TV, and Mom and Dad had a TV in their bedroom, and I was laying down with them, and we were watching the conclave, and and he would joke. He knew he was going to die, so he would say, "Oh, well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to help pick the Pope," and it was such a, And then it was, my brother's name's Ben. And so we made all these connections. It was Pope Benedict the 16th. Dad passed away on the 16th. I don't know. It was just, Be Not Afraid was a huge theme. Huge. So in between the time of 2005 and 2008, I went to college. I got married and I had a baby. Always the impatient one. I wanted to move my life along in warp speed. On November 6th, 2008, my stepdad, Keith, Mom had remarried and she married Keith Murphy. Keith called and asked to speak with Caleb, and I could overhear him telling Caleb to sit down. In that moment, he informed him that my 16-year-old brother had died by suicide. There is not a whole lot that I remember from that moment forward on that day. I do remember a sickness coming over me and really a true disbelief that the feeling that I could wake up from it, or if I just prayed hard enough, or just if I prayed hard enough that it wasn't going to be true, but it was. That wasn't, I couldn't will that to go away. So we drove home from Lexington to Owensboro with our 3-month-old. I do remember feeling that was a very long drive home. That was definitely a turning point in my life. I had a lot of worries, and I would say that the sadness that, I was really afraid with a 3-month-old that all of the despair and the sadness that my family was experiencing was going to rub off on my newborn baby. Babies are very perceptive, and I kept thinking, how can I prevent that from happening? Will she feel this pain by default because my husband and I are so sad? How can I stop crying? Do I need to, grieve away from her and just, do that in a totally separate, compartmentalize that part of my life to shield her from it? How can I take the lead and be there for my mother and my sister and my husband and fulfill a promise to my dad to keep our family strong and together? I think, tragedies, there's an opportunity there for tragedies to tear your family apart. There's an opportunity for a bond to be created that's just absolutely can't be shaken. But I think it's easy for families to just be torn apart because of what they're experiencing. So that was a fear. There were so many, there were rational fears and lots of irrational fears. I thought, how close is everybody to dying? Do I need to distance or, I love really, really hard. And that comes with a lot of pain when the people that you love die. So, it was just panic overload. My mom and Keith, and I have to say, Keith is an amazing and wonderful faith-filled man. My sister, Brett, and her husband, Brett, and Caleb and I, after this catastrophe, we have an incredible bond. It is the bond that you hear people talk about when they've survived a catastrophe together. It's an experience that we share, and we're all incredibly, incredibly close. And Felicity, my oldest, ironically, her patron saint is Saint Felicity, and that's the patron saint of bereaved mothers. I am convinced that God had a hand in us picking that name. It's just, my mom had suffered such a huge loss in a very short time with, the loss of her husband. And she was only 39, and I'm 34 right now, so I can't imagine still that, how that affected her to have lost her husband that she was married to for almost 20 years, and then 3 years later, her only son. So when Felicity was born, it was a gift that we, needed to pull our family together, and then also to bring us out of our intense grief. We still grieved, but it was, she was a gift that was given to us. She was born on August 12th. My brother's birthday is August 11th. So we celebrate, his birthday, and we then the next day, and obviously that comes with it a lot of pain, but the next day we celebrate life too. It's just, it is a gift. But these tragedies, they illustrate the central theme of my faith and my Catholicism. If I'm going to question God's motives for letting these sorrows enter into our lives, I must also ask who God is. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And eventually Peter responds with my favorite exchange in the whole Bible. Peter boldly states, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus responds, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And I think that that's an interesting, everything that goes on with Peter, in my opinion, in the Bible. On one hand, you have someone who is asked a question by Jesus. I mean, he asked it to all of his disciples, and Peter boldly says that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But also, just a little while later, he also denies him 3 times. And I can relate spiritually to that, not so much denial, but distancing myself from the conversation about religion out of fear. That happens, I think, on occasion. You can feel so confident in your faith, but not really discuss it. So you can also have an ability to talk about it really, really well. But when, the rubber meets the road, do you cower? So I feel like it's really interesting to have someone like Peter who is, right on the money. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then also see that fear take over also. So if I really believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of the living God, then I have to let go of things that I cannot find answers to. And that took me a while to do. I want answers and reason my way into things, reason my way out of things. So, but if I really if I really believe that, then I have to remember that death and suffering and tragedy are things I might not ever be able to get answers to. And I do believe that. Even when I have a hard time hearing God's voice, or when I'm plagued with apathy or spiritual laziness, or when I'm like Peter and lack the courage to proclaim my faith more publicly, I would say that in my finding faith journey, those themes are a mainstay in my spiritual life. I listen to Bishop Barron very often, and when he discusses Job in one of his YouTube videos, it hits home when I think of the loss that my mother and my sister and my family and anyone who has ever experienced tragedy. Job, innocent, asked God, "You know that I am innocent. Why am I suffering so much?" And God speaks, and Bishop Barron says this is the longest of any of the speeches by God in the Bible. It's the biggest exchange. And he says, "Job, where were you when I made the heavens and the earth? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? And where were you when I told the sea where to stop," etc. There's this, kind of remembering that my ways are not your ways. This resonates with me so deeply because of a couple of reasons. And like anyone who's experienced any kind of tragedy or difficulty, you ask why. Like, why are you allowing this to happen to me? If you put me here, you've given me life. If you've put me here, why does this have to be so hard? But I think that in my arrogant, zeal for answers, I can appreciate being humbled by the fact that I'm a human. I think God is so big, and his plans are not our plans. I think when God answers Job, as Bishop Barron says in his video about this, he says that he's not necessarily answering him, but situating the question in an ever wider framework of meaning. So I think I have to remember that what I experience is within an infinitely complex framework, and to have faith or to find it and to keep it, that means that I must recognize who God is, and I should not be afraid.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing your story with us. And I want to begin by saying that I am sorry for the losses that you have experienced. And I guess my first question for you is, any one of these moments alone could have been a make it or break it in your faith. And you had 3 of these tragedies occur within a very short amount of time. What do you think it is that helped keep your family together, helped keep your family from turning away from God during these experiences of sorrow and tragedy?
That's a tough one. I don't think I really know exactly, how we were able to stay grounded. And there was doubts, definitely. I think when you experience loss or pain of any type, you don't even have to experience loss to grieve. I think that when that happens, you can become numb, or you can pray more. I definitely personally prayed a lot during that time, but the foundation was already laid there with my spirituality, my parents laying that foundation, my dad getting into apologetics. All of these things are like puzzle pieces, and they mapped together so perfectly that when you look back on it, it's kind of like this, I understand that now, and it's sometimes a question you didn't even ask, it's like, oh, okay, I get it. That's why you made me this way, or that's why I am the way I am. That, I think the foundation was there. And as far as us, continuing to stay faithful, I think that's a lot that just as a shield, I think that God had given us. I don't know. I don't really know, because I think that if you think about that, why doesn't a shield happen for everybody? That's a hard question to answer. I don't really know why we were able. I do think that, like I said, there's a bunch of pieces of the puzzle that are, I'm able to piece together, and it was just a protective shield over our family.
So I think you hit on something really important. You talked about it early on in your story, but also you bring it out in this answer, and that's the importance of looking back.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like oftentimes we may not be able to really understand or hear all the messages that God has for us in moments of despair or tragedy or sorrow or whatever, which is why we have to not look back and focus on behind, I guess, so much as reflect on, maybe that's a better word, reflect on what's happened in our past and allow God to walk with us through that, because he does have messages and answers that sometimes you don't even ask the questions to.
Absolutely.
And we can easily miss those in the throes of whatever we're going through. But when we walk backwards, when we reflect on them, we see these messages come up. We see these little places in which he was holding. I know in my own story, I've found those moments where he was walking with me or beside me, and I didn't even recognize that he was there.
Yes, I think that you can appreciate the unknown as time goes on. So you didn't know why things happened, the way they did, but you can also appreciate, you may not know, because in other areas, a light was shined on why. So there's that hope that eventually the light will be shined on why on something else. So as you are able to get answers, and if you don't get answers, there's just that hope there that maybe that's not part of the equation at this point, and later you can appreciate the unknown. I think that's something that I've learned with all of that, is that I can't control what I don't know, and that's just it.
I want to talk a little bit about these instances of suicide that have occurred in your life. Is that okay to talk about?
Yes.
The first thing, I am a very much an English person, and so I know that words matter. How you say things matter. So when I was reading through your story, one of the things that caught my eye was you say died by suicide, as opposed to committed suicide. And I just wanted to ask you, was that intentional?
Yes.
And why you chose that particular phrasing?
I think I agree. Words are very important. So I chose died by suicide because I do think that it conveys the thought that this might not have been an intentional an act of committing to do something where you've had a lot of thought that goes into it. I'm not saying that some people don't have planning that there, but a full understanding of the consequences, the committing that, I don't think that is there, because it goes against one's own nature to not want to survive. So I think we all have to remember that mental health, the brain is another organ, and organs can fail. And so that's the direction I think died by suicide. And it's a really common phrase in survivors of suicide circles. They don't really like that committed, like that word. And I still say it on accident, it's a part of the lexicon and but died by suicide does convey something different than committed suicide. So that was intentional.
For those who may not be aware of the Catholic Church's teachings on suicide, if it's okay, I'd just like to take a moment to make people aware of what that is. It used to be that when someone died by suicide, they weren't even allowed a Christian funeral or Christian burial because it was seen as a mortal sin, taking of one's own life. And so people who had died by suicide weren't even allowed to be, I believe, may not have even been allowed to be buried in a Christian cemetery because it was seen as such a grave sin. But as our understanding of mental health, of how the brain works, has grown over the past decades, the church has kind of updated, I guess is a good way to say that, her teaching on this particular matter, and because we do have a better understanding of people. And so essentially what the church says is that we can't know one way or the other because only God knows the heart. So we don't know what was in a person's heart at the time that they died, but for a mortal sin to have occurred, it has to be a grave matter. You have to know it is a grave matter, and you have to do it anyway. And the church says we don't know if people are choosing this freely. So we don't know if they can meet that criterion for it to be a mortal sin because we don't know what's in their heart. We don't know what's in their mind. We don't know what's happening in them. Personally, so I'm switching to my personal self, when I talk to people about this particular subject matter, I believe that there's no way, like you said, we as humans are wired to survive.
Right. Yes.
We're fighters. We don't.
Exactly.
And so I can't believe that someone who would do that is in a place where they can freely choose anything. They literally have to be out of their mind.
Exactly.
And I don't mean that in a mean or rude manner. Please don't take it that way. But they can't be in their right mind. Maybe that's a better way to say it. They cannot be in their right mind and therefore cannot freely choose anything.
Yes.
Because they're in such a low and dark place. And I know that this is an issue that has affected Whitesville in many families.
Yes.
So I know this is a particularly sensitive subject around here. Because it is a very sensitive issue. If you don't mind my asking, what was the community response, people's response to you, your family, to this incident happening in your lives?
We had a huge outpouring of support. And, to echo on what you said, the community had experienced it more than a few times and very recently, before 2008. So they were geared and ready to pour that support out. I mean, that was huge. And the same can be said of my dad too. When he passed away, there was a huge community outpouring of support. My mom has a really huge family too. And she's the 10th of 13 and all of the family was very, very supportive. That's probably another thing to kind of talk about what we discussed earlier about that foundation and why we were able to stick together. Because we had our own family foundation, that unit there, but then we had all of these other players that were involved and helpful. And our family was just, we're all so close, and the community that played, a huge role too. So I still, I don't live in Whitesville anymore, but I live, in Owensboro, but I still feel a close-knit, there's that catastrophe type thing. You have a solidarity with the people that you experience catastrophe with. Yeah. So that's, it's kind of almost like you recognize, you're like, hey, solidarity.
I guess the last thing I want to ask on the topic of the suicides that affected your life and your family, you mentioned having all of these fears, some irrational, some rational, surrounding the death of your brother. So how did you overcome those fears, or where did you turn to seek support for those?
Time has a lot to do with that. I don't know that, some of the fears were just outright, oh my gosh, this person that could die, and my husband would be on his way to work or on his way back from work, and I would just all of a sudden be gripped and by this irrational fear that he was going to be in a car wreck, which was so intrusive. That was not, it was just very, very intrusive. And those kind of things were what happened. And I think time probably for me was, also, my husband's very good at explaining when I'm being irrational. So and there's a lot to be said for that. What I would call, he would be like, okay, let's, say this out loud and see, discuss it. This is okay. And then there's that control thing. Like, what can I control? Nothing. So there's that, that reminder. No, there's nothing I can control. I can pray. I can trust, and I can let it be. So that was something I think that it took a lot of time to come to terms with that, because by nature, I'm the oldest of three. I have a need to kind of try to control my situation when I can. And that I can let go of that a lot, not always, but that was what I needed to do in order to stop letting these intrusive thoughts take over my life.
Yeah, take hold of you.
Yes, yeah.
And tragedy and grief have a very unfortunate way of doing that to a person.
Yes.
Of really making them irrational at times.
Yes.
And you never know when grief is going to hit.
No. I always say it's like you're in an ocean and you are being, hit by these smaller waves, and then all of a sudden this huge rogue wave hits you and drowns you. And then you come back up after a little while. And that's exactly, in my opinion, the way that feels. You can be floating along just fine, and then a season will change, and all of a sudden, you're underwater. So, but you come back up. God's got a little, he throws you a line. So
gives you a lifeline.
That's right.
I'd also like to talk a little bit about your father's passing, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that you mentioned that stuck out to me was, talking about planning your dad's funeral with him. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, and I was pretty close to her, and I remember planning her funeral with her, in very grandmother fashion. I remember her telling us she didn't want any roses at her funeral. She didn't want any carnations
At her funeral.
She said they had to be roses, and she said she would come back and haunt us if we put carnations in there. And so we made sure there were no carnations. Actually, I think somebody slipped some in, but like
carnation-free zone.
Right? But those are the things that you remember.
Oh, yeah.
I guess if you could just talk a little bit about this time frame, like what's going on in your heart as you're helping him plan his funeral in these last days leading up to his death.
We knew that the doctors had warned us even before he took that turn. The turn that happened, after Christmas was very quick. So from December to April, it was a very downhill. Hospice was called in. That's only just, a few months. And before that, though, we were told by the doctors that the prognosis was poor. He didn't respond to prednisone, which is the treatment that typically works well. He was steroid refractory, I believe is what they called it. So he was not responding the way that he should have. So my husband and I, we weren't married then, but we did know that he was going to pass away. So actually, Caleb asked my dad for permission to, for us to get married, engaged. And we knew it was going to be a longer engagement, but he did want to have Dad's blessing before he passed away. So a lot of what was going on in my mind, there's a lot of self-centeredness there, was my dad's not going to see my family grow. Walking, me down the aisle, my sister's family grow. Those were the thoughts that were going through my mind. And, I did discuss it with him, and he said he was always going to be there. And he is. I mean, he is. But those were the thoughts that were circulating in my mind at that time. I was 18. And I just wanted him to be there really bad.
You said you were very cringeworthy, or that these were cringeworthy moments for you.
Gosh.
But honestly, I think that's human nature.
I do too. I mean, I do. I think we have to allow some grace for, I do.
Absolutely.
But when I think back on it, I'm just like, oh gosh, here he is, 47, and loved his life. So, and then he knows he's going to die. I still can't even really wrap my head around that, trying to think about what that must feel like, to be given a terminal.
Well, and because he would know that those are the things he's going to miss out on too.
Yes. So
he's never going to.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then reflecting on the pain that your child is going to have when you leave and all of that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, it's cringeworthy in that, I don't know. But it's a teenager. I do give myself a little grace, but whenever I wrote it, I was like, yuck. But I think Dad's probably like, it's okay.
I think we all think back on our years as 18-year-olds.
I'm sure.
I think there's a few things I could have done differently.
Yes, no doubt.
If it's okay, I'd like to move past the tragedy and ask a few questions about some of the other things that you'd mentioned.
Yes.
One, I completely identify with you when you say that you're strong-willed and an arguer and continue to be so.
A challenger.
But time and maturity have softened that significantly, but it'll never go away. No. I felt that in my core. Because you also mentioned that this was your number one lesson was be quiet. Mm-hmm. You also said you are a mother of 5.
Yes.
So how do you find quiet in your life?
I definitely take time for myself. I'll go upstairs in my room, and I had mentioned that I listen to Bishop Barron's YouTube videos often, and that's really my quiet time to think and reflect. But also, not all of my kids are quite as outgoing. My oldest, she's a lot like her dad. She's very quiet. I think God gives you different personalities in your own family, and that also helps you to appreciate a point of view other than your own. So, because I know for me, I had mentioned earlier, I like to rationalize everything and reason. And when somebody doesn't think the exact same way that I do, I'm like, what? This doesn't, what are you talking about? And my husband will quickly remind me, not everybody thinks the same way as you. So, and having 5 children definitely is a huge in your face, like, that's just the way it is. It's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to learn and to appreciate the different personalities in your life. So I think that's been another intentional piece of the puzzle. And I can look at that and say, thank you, God, for putting that into my life and giving me these blessings, because it is a way to teach and humble, and I needed it.
I find that my children are my greatest blessings and also my greatest struggles.
Yes.
At times, they purify me. Mm-hmm. They are burning the impurities out, and they're making me holy day by day, sometimes minute by minute.
I can relate.
Yes, I can imagine, but I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah. Oh, never. No, just a wonderful gift. I mean, there's a song, and I don't know who sings it, but he says, I love this crazy, tragic, sometimes almost magic, awful, beautiful life. Yes, I think about that all the time, though, because it's very true.
So one of the last things that you talked about was that if you are to question God's motives for letting these sorrows enter your life, you must also ask who he is. Mm-hmm. And to illustrate that point, you talk about this event between Peter and Jesus, where Peter is boldly saying that you are the Messiah. And then shortly after, he denies him 3 times. Yes. I first have to say, I love Peter.
Me too.
Because he's such a lovable screw up.
Yes. Yes. a reminder that you can be the rock of the church and also a coward.
Exactly.
Both.
Yeah.
Not to say, I don't know if that's good to use for St. Peter, but the rock of our church, and
imperfect at the same
imperfect.
time. Yeah.
Boisterous,
Very
ruffian,
hot-tempered.
hot-tempered. Absolutely.
These are the qualities of a saint.
I know.
It gives me hope for myself. But I just thought that was an interesting, worth bringing out, because Peter is he's such an amazing person, and an illustrator of our faith.
Peter, I had written this down too, that, as Peter was growing in his faith, and as we grow in our faith and our closeness to God, that I think Travis Roby mentioned the honeymoon phase in the podcast and his podcast. And that really struck a nerve with me, because that's really true. You can have this moment where you're like, wow, this is amazing. You just feel on fire with the Holy Spirit, and you just want to go to church every day, and you want to say the rosary, and there really is this honeymoon phase. And then the closer you get with God and your relationship, there, as it grows, I also think at the same time there can be a temptation so God will pull your strengths out, but the devil will exploit your weaknesses too. So I think that gets harder the closer that you get. I mean, maybe not, but that's been my experience. There are probably a lot of people that just stay very disciplined and continue on their path. But for me, I do think that as I have learned about Catholicism and grown stronger in my faith, there's also this, exploitation of my own, weaknesses. So apathy or laziness, or the dark night of the soul, making excuses and trying to reason my way out of things that I know I don't have. I think that's another thing that can happen with people as long as you're aware that can happen, and try to stay disciplined in it.
I'll say too, though, that even those disciplined people, they may look like they have it together from the outside, but I think something that occurs to me is this story of the prodigal son. You have the one who walked away, who wandered, who has all the issues, and you think like, oh, what a bad son. Look at the other son.
Yeah.
So good, so disciplined, he stayed, but what was his sin?
Right.
Pride. So, we all have various struggles. And I think you're right. The devil does like to exploit our weaknesses, whether it be apathy or lethargy or pride. And we have to be constantly on guard for those, for him exploiting those, because that's what he does. He's the father of lies.
Exactly.
He will always tell us that we are not good enough, or that person's not good enough, or to exploit us. There's a quote that I recently heard, and it goes, "The devil knows you by your name, but calls you by your sin. God knows your sin, but calls you by your name." The devil will always call us by our sin and call our attention to our sin and the ways in which we're failing.
That gave me the chills.
Whereas God will always call us by our name and remind us that we've been claimed and we are his.
Yeah. And I think that comes to, full circle to the whole fear, that do not be afraid. When you are called by your sin, then you can fear or not feel worthy, and all these things can go through your mind. And, then you have to remember, if you're not afraid, then who's on your side.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us today and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is an honor. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening here today. If you are interested in hearing more stories of finding faith and encountering, tune in next week for our next guest. If you have any questions, need someone to journey with, or would be interested in sharing your story, please contact me at findingfaith123@gmail.com.